When it comes to creating an inclusive environment for people with disabilities, did you know that sometimes there are hidden barriers at church that many people don't realize? Today, we're going to take a look at 4 barriers that impact people with mobility impairments. So glad you're here today. When it comes to churches, most believe that they are welcoming and inclusive for all people. But how often do we actually make sure that this is really true for people with disabilities? Many times, hidden barriers exist all around us, but often people without disabilities never even see them. Today, we're going to look at 4 of these barriers that affect people with mobility impairments. Because the truth is, your church might not be as inclusive as you think. Physical disability in the church, mobility impairments, and inclusion. Number 1, parking. So the first barrier starts right out front, in the parking lot. Now I know many of you watching this are saying, no worries, we have a few accessible parking spaces already. Our church is good. Well, maybe or maybe not. Were you aware that accessible parking is more complex than just having a few reserved spaces in your lot? The number of accessible parking spaces offered should be based on the overall amount of parking spaces you have. The more spaces you have, the more accessible spaces you should offer too. And every 1 in 6 of those accessible spots should be van accessible. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that if you have a family who has a loved one who uses a wheelchair or other mobility device, they may need to have a special van that can accommodate that. And those vans may have ramps or lifts that enable entering and exiting of the vehicle. This is why accessible van parking is surrounded by diagonal lines called access aisles. These areas give a van space for the ramp or lift. Without this designated space, a person using a mobility device cannot exit or enter their van. And yeah, that's a big problem. Which means it's also a big problem when people who aren't familiar with this think it's okay to park their smaller vehicles in the access aisle. And it also means that even if you have many spaces for accessible parking, but only 1 space for accessible van parking, then only 1 family who needs an accessible van can actually come to your church. And that's not very accessible at all. Number 2, the restroom. Again, you may be thinking, well, at least I know my church has got this one right. After all, we have accessible stalls in our restrooms with rails. Well, are you sure that this stall is accessible for both people who use manual or power wheelchairs? Because some stalls don't work well for both. Or what about people who need assistance in the restroom and their caregiver is a different gender than they are? Does your church have a family bathroom where both can enter and have privacy? And if you do have a family restroom, does it have an adult-sized changing table in it? Because if it doesn't, then where will the person be changed? On the dirty bathroom floor? Yikes! No one wants that. Making sure that your church is accessible isn't just about noticing what you do have, but also about noticing what you don't have. Number 3, access. So we all know it's important that people can have access to the church. So if you have an entrance ramp or your church is only 1 story, then you're good, right? Well, is there a ramp to your church's main stage so anyone can join the praise team or speak to the congregation? What about meeting rooms? Are the doors wide enough for a wheelchair to get through? Or if it's up the stairs, is there elevator access? And what about the play area? Are there ways for kids with mobility issues to be part of the fun too? The truth is, when we designate certain areas to be wheelchair accessible, but we ignore other areas, what we're actually doing is limiting the amount of participation and personal growth an individual with mobility issues can have at church. And growing at church should never have limits. Number 4, assumptions. Now, for the first time in this list, we're not going to be talking about the church building. We're going to be talking about the church body. Luckily, when it comes to churches, there are never any issues with people within the church body, right? Oh, wait. Anyway, When it comes to social inclusion, it's really important for people in the church to not make assumptions about a person's abilities, desires, or feelings. For instance, never assume that a person has an intellectual impairment just because they have a physical disability. This is usually not the case at all. And never assume that when it comes to activities like sports, a person with physical limitations is happy to sit on the sidelines. Instead, talk to them and find out how they would like to be included. Maybe even offer some options like being a coach, a scorekeeper, or part of the cheer squad. Or see if they would like a buddy to help them participate. Because the biggest win that you can have is that everyone feels like part of the team. And don't forget, never assume that you know how someone feels. For instance, if a group is doing something that includes physical movements that are challenging for a person, even a normally very outgoing person may suddenly become shy or act uninterested. But actually, they may just be trying to cope with the fact that there are some things that they just can't do. So be a friend, and if you see that someone can't do the same thing that everyone else is doing, why not join them in what they can do instead? Well, I think we learned a lot, but there's one more thing before you go. The best way to create a more inclusive church is to invite someone who has a disability to teach you what going to your church is really like for them. Because the more you learn, the more everyone can feel welcome. So I hope this video helped you become more aware of some of the hidden barriers that are in the church. But I hope you'll also know that the best way to break down those barriers is to keep on learning. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.